I had developed Schindler's List for over 10 years before I made it. I got the
No one was prepared for what Steven Spielberg would finally reveal. Not the media, not Hollywood, and certainly not the fans who believed they already knew everything about Rob Reiner. Two legendary directors, two very different styles. One shared passion for storytelling, and one tragedy so devastating that it silenced even the most powerful voices in cinema. For decades, Steven Spielberg was known as the master of awe and wonder, while Rob Reiner became the architect of laughter, warmth, and deeply human stories. They weren't inseparable friends, but within Hollywood, they were bound by mutual respect, admiration, and countless moments exchanged quietly behind the scenes. Then, without warning, everything collapsed. When the news of Rob Reiner's sudden and tragic death spread across Hollywood, Spielberg was left frozen in disbelief. Those who saw him that day said his eyes filled with tears almost immediately. This wasn't just the loss of a colleague, this was the loss of someone who represented the very soul of sincere, human centered filmmaking. Just 2 months earlier, Spielberg clearly remembered standing beside Rob at a private Hollywood gathering. Rob's face was glowing with a happiness Spielberg hadn't seen in years. That night, Rob spoke excitedly about his son Nick. He said Nick had finally beaten addiction. He said his family was healing. He said hope had returned. Spielberg believed him. They spoke about future films, untold stories, and the joy of still creating even after decades in the industry. For a brief moment, it felt like life had given Rob Reiner a second chance at peace. But fate had already written a far darker ending. What Spielberg would later confess is something no one expected: a private memory, a painful conversation, and a truth so haunting that even the Spielberg himself struggled to put it into words. Because in the end, the greatest tragedy was not something written in a script. It was real, it was personal, and it destroyed a family from the inside. When Steven Spielberg finally addressed the media, it wasn't at a grand press conference. There were no flashing lights, no rehearsed statements. It was a rare, quiet interview. And from the very first sentence, everyone listening could hear it. His voice was different. Spielberg paused several times, struggling to keep his composure, before softly admitting that Rob Reiner's death had shaken him in a way few losses ever had. He said Rob was not just a respected filmmaker, but a companion on a long, shared cinematic journey, someone who understood why stories mattered and why human emotion always came before spectacle. He described the moment he received the news, how he sat in silence, how memories flooded back all at once. Spielberg emphasized that Rob's passing was not only a loss for Hollywood, but for anyone who believed cinema could make people feel less alone. According to him, Rob Reiner had a rare gift. He could make audiences laugh, cry, and reflect all within the same story without ever losing sincerity. As the Spielberg spoke, those close to him noticed his hands slowly clenching, as if he were trying to hold on to something slipping away. He recalled the first time he met Rob, both of them young, ambitious, and full of dreams in an industry that hadn't yet tested them. Rob, he said, was always humble, always listening, always more interested in people than power. Spielberg remembered watching Rob work, seeing how deeply he explored his characters, how he treated every human emotion as something sacred. He said Rob believed filmmaking wasn't just art, but a bridge that connected people across generations. Then Spielberg's tone changed. His eyes dropped, his voice lowered. He admitted that behind Rob's warm smile and creative brilliance, there was a private pain that few truly understood. A pain that Rob carried quietly even while making the world laugh. And that pain, Spielberg revealed, was rooted in his family. In the next part, Spielberg would share a moment he had never spoken about publicly before. A night at a private party, a quiet balcony, and a confession from Rob Reiner that has still haunted him years later. It was a warm evening at a private Hollywood gathering years before the tragedy. Laughter filled the room. Old stories about films drifted through the air. For most guests, it was just another elegant night among industry friends, but Steven Spielberg noticed something that didn't belong. Across the room, standing alone near the corner, was Rob Reiner. He wasn't smiling. Rob held a glass of wine, staring into nothing, his shoulders slightly slumped. He looked tired, distant. Nothing like the man known for infectious laughter and boundless warmth. Spielberg walked over and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's been a long time," he said quietly. "You don't look well. Is something wrong?" Rob looked at him for a long moment. Then, without saying a word, he nodded and gestured toward the balcony. Away from the noise, away from the crowd, away from the image everyone knew. Once outside, Rob exhaled heavily, as if he had been holding his breath for years. He began to speak. Rob told Spielberg that his son, Nick, was struggling again. Addiction had consumed him for years. Rehab after rehab, hope followed by relapse, promises that collapsed into disappointment. Rob said he was trying to be both a father and a friend, but felt completely powerless. Spielberg recalled feeling the weight in every word Rob spoke. This wasn't a famous director talking. This was a terrified father. Rob admitted that Nick's addiction began when he was still a teenager. Heroin, cocaine, endless cycles of recovery and collapse. He said he and his wife had tried everything, the best treatment centers, keeping Nick close at home, constant supervision, nothing worked. Rob's voice trembled when he confessed that he had even made a film with Nick, hoping that creating something together might heal them. For a brief moment, it seemed to help. Nick stayed clean. The family felt closer, but the darkness always returned. "I'm terrified," Rob whispered. "Terrified that one day I'll lose him forever." Spielberg tried to comfort him. He told Rob that he had done everything a father could possibly do, that Nick was lucky to be loved so deeply. But Rob shook his head. "The more I try to save him," he said softly, "the more powerless I'll feel." The two men sat in silence, the city lights glowing behind them. No advice could fix this. No words could undo the fear. Years later, Spielberg would realize that this moment was not just a confession. It was a warning, and tragically, it was one that came true. Time moved forward, even though the fear never truly left. Years passed, seasons changed, and life, as it always does, continued on the surface. The last time Steven Spielberg saw Rob Reiner was in October 2025 at the Governor's Awards held by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences in Los Angeles. It was a formal evening filled with familiar faces, legendary names, and conversations soaked in nostalgia. Veterans of Hollywood gathered to remember old triumphs and celebrate a lifetime devoted to cinema. As Spielberg entered the hall, he spotted Rob from across the room, and immediately something felt different. Rob was smiling, not the polite, professional smile reserved for public appearances, but a genuine one, the kind that lights up the eyes, the kind Spielberg hadn't seen in years. They walked toward each other and embraced tightly, patting each other's backs like brothers who had shared too much history to speak it aloud. "You look great," Spielberg said warmly. "How have you been?" Rob laughed, a deep, joyful sound that echoed through the noise of the room. "Steven," he said, almost unable to contain himself, "you wouldn't believe it. Nick is home. He's doing so much better. He's been clean for months. He's working again. He's talking to us. It feels like we finally got our son back." Spielberg felt a rush of relief. He remembered the quiet balcony, the fear, the tears Rob tried to hide. This felt like a miracle. He placed a hand on Rob's shoulder and told him how happy he was, how proud he was of both Rob and his wife for never giving up, for enduring years of pain and uncertainty. Hope, it seemed, had finally won. That night, they stood to the side of the ceremony, talking about new films, young actors, and stories still waiting to be told. But Spielberg later admitted that what stayed with him most was Rob's expression. There was peace in it. For the first time in a long while, Rob Reiner looked like a man who could breathe. As they parted ways, Spielberg told him something simple: "Hold on to that hope." Rob nodded, his eyes shining. But just 2 months later, in December, the news struck like thunder from a clear sky. Rob Reiner was gone, and with him, every fragile piece of hope that had just begun to glow was extinguished in an instant. Spielberg would later say that this was the moment he realized how cruel and unpredictable life truly is, how quickly happiness can turn into unbearable loss. In the next part, Spielberg confronts the aftermath, the shock, the grief, and the memory that continues to haunt him to this day. Spielberg was at home when the news reached him. No dramatic phone call, no warning, just a sudden headline that didn't make sense. For several long seconds, he simply stared at the screen, convinced there had been a mistake. Rob Reiner, gone along with his wife. The words felt unreal, like something pulled from a cruel screenplay no one would ever approve. He read it again and again. Then his hands began to shake. Spielberg later admitted that what devastated him most was not only the loss itself, but the brutal irony behind it. Just weeks earlier, Rob had been smiling, laughing, speaking about hope as if it were finally solid beneath his feet. Now that hope was gone, Spielberg sat in silence, memories replaying uncontrollably. The balcony, the confession, the fear Rob had whispered years ago, terrified of losing his son forever. That fear had never left Rob, and in the end, it became reality. What followed was a grief Spielberg struggled to process. He said it felt different from other losses in his life. He had lost friends before, colleagues, legions, but this one felt personal in a way he couldn't escape. He immediately reached out to the Reiner family, sending his deepest condolences. In a public message, Spielberg wrote that Hollywood had lost a bright star, a storyteller who touched millions, not through a spectacle, but through honesty. Behind closed doors, however, Spielberg was haunted by one thought. He kept replaying his final words to Rob: "Hold on to hope." At the time, it felt right. Now, it felt painfully fragile. In the days that followed, Spielberg found himself unable to work. He avoided scripts, avoided meetings. Instead, he returned to something familiar, something safe. He rewatched Rob's films. As the opening notes played, as the laughter returned, Spielberg felt tears streaming down his face. Those films were no longer just entertainment. They were proof of who Rob Reiner truly was. A man who believed in kindness, connection, and humanity even while carrying unbearable pain inside. And it was then that Spielberg realized something heartbreaking. Rob had spent his life making people feel less alone. Yet in his darkest moments, he himself had felt powerless. In the next part, Spielberg reflects on Rob Reiner's legacy, the hidden cost of being a storyteller, and why this loss forced him to rethink what truly matters in life. In the quiet days after the tragedy, Steven Spielberg found himself returning again and again to the same question. What does a filmmaker leave behind when the cameras stop rolling? Late one night, alone in his living room, Spielberg rewatched The Princess Bride. He had seen it countless times before, but this time was different. Every line felt heavier, every smile carried a shadow. When the familiar words, "as you wish," echoed through the room, Spielberg smiled through tears. That was Rob Reiner. Not the headlines, not the tragedy, but the heart. Spielberg said Rob's greatest achievement was never box office numbers or awards. It was his ability to remind people of their own humanity. Rob made films that spoke softly, yet stayed forever. Stories about friendship, love, loyalty, and growing up. Stories that felt simple on the surface, but carried deep emotional truth underneath. And only now did Spielberg fully understand the cost of that gift. Rob had given everything to others: his time, his creativity, his emotional strength. He poured his soul into stories that helped audiences heal, laugh, and feel understood. But behind the scenes, Rob was fighting a battle no script could resolve. Spielberg reflected on how many artists carry invisible pain, how success does not shield anyone from fear, from heartbreak, or from the helplessness of watching someone you love suffer. He admitted that Rob's death forced him to confront something uncomfortable about his own life, that no matter how great the films, no matter how loud the applause, family and human connection are what truly endure. In his final public message, Spielberg wrote that Hollywood felt darker without Rob Reiner, but he also said that Rob's films would continue to shine, lighting the way for generations who may never know the man behind the camera, yet feel him in every frame. Rob, Spielberg said quietly, you lived fully, and you will never be forgotten. But the story does not end there, because as Spielberg honored his friend, he also turned inward, reflecting on his own journey, his own childhood wounds, and the path that shaped him into the storyteller the world knows today. Before the world called him a genius, before the Oscars, the box office records, and the standing ovations, Steven Spielberg was just a boy trying to survive a childhood that never felt stable. He was born on December 18th, 1946, in Cincinnati, Ohio, into a Jewish family with Eastern European roots. He was the oldest child and the only son, surrounded by three younger sisters. His father, Arnold, was an electrical engineer, always busy with the massive early computers of that era. His mother, Leah, was a pianist full of warmth, the kind of woman whose smile could make a room feel safe. But safety didn't last long, because Spielberg's childhood was defined by movement, packing boxes, new cities, new schools, new faces. Every time he began to feel comfortable, his family moved again for his father's work. And with each move, the world he had just started to recognize vanished. Spielberg later admitted that every relocation felt like losing a piece of himself, but it also taught him something that would shape his entire future: how to observe, how to listen, how to stay quiet and study people, because he never had enough time to belong. At age 6, his parents took him to see a film about the circus. The lights went down, the screen came alive, and the boy sat completely still, eyes wide open. When the movie ended, he clutched his mother's hand and whispered something that sounded like a child's dream, but was actually a prophecy. I want to make things that scare people and make them feel joy like that. His mother stroked his hair and told him he first had to learn how to tell stories, and Spielberg never forgot that. When he was 12, his father gave him an 8mm camera. From that moment, it wasn't just a hobby, it was an escape. Spielberg began filming everything around him: family trips, small scenes, toy trains crashing in dramatic setups. He staged himself. In a strange way, he was trying to control the chaos of his life through film, creating fear on a screen. So real fear felt less powerful. But the world outside his home was not kind. In 1957, when the family moved to Phoenix, Arizona, Spielberg became one of very few Jewish children in the area. He was bullied, isolated, humiliated. He later spoke about the punches, the insults, the cold feeling of being treated like he didn't belong. And instead of fighting back, Spielberg did what he always did. He watched, he studied people, he absorbed their cruelty, their insecurity, their fear, and unknowingly, he was building the emotional foundation for the stories that would later move millions. By 13, he made a 40-minute war film titled Escape to Nowhere and won a prize in a youth film competition. By 16, he poured his savings into a science fiction film called Firelight, more than 2 hours long, and even screened it at a local theater for a small audience. It wasn't a big crowd, but for a Spielberg, it was enough, because he walked out of that theater believing one thing with every part of his soul: one day people would line up to watch his films. But just when his dream was growing stronger, his family life was about to collapse in a way that would scar him for years. The summer Spielberg turned 16 should have been ordinary: a family camping trip, a quiet escape from constant moving, a moment to feel normal. Instead, it became the moment that shattered his world. While filming casually with his camera, Steven accidentally captured something he was never meant to see: his mother Leah standing close to Bernie Adler, his father's closest friend, their hands touching, their expressions intimate, real. Steven froze, he turned off the camera, and he said nothing. For 3 long years, that secret stayed locked inside him. When his parents finally divorced in 1965, Steven believed he already knew the truth, but he misunderstood it completely. His father Arnold took the blame. He never defended himself, never explained, never pointed fingers. Steven, still a teenager, turned his anger entirely toward his father. He accused him of destroying the family. He moved to California with Arnold, but emotionally he shut him out. Arnold accepted it in silence. For 15 years, Spielberg carried resentment like a wound that refused to heal. That pain became fuel. It bled into his films, shaping broken families, distant fathers, and children searching for belonging. Only much later did Steven learn the truth. His mother had been the one in love with another man. His father had protected her, choosing to carry the blame so his children wouldn't see her differently. When Spielberg finally realized what had really happened, the guilt was overwhelming. Years of anger had been directed at the wrong person. Years that could never be recovered. That revelation changed him forever. It softened his view of his father. It deepened his understanding of sacrifice, and it reshaped how he saw love, responsibility, and forgiveness. Decades later, Spielberg would finally confront this wound through filmmaking itself. He would turn pain into a story, silence into confession, and memory into truth. And that would lead to one of the most personal films of his entire career. After the divorce, Spielberg didn't just lose the family he once knew. He lost the feeling of safety. He carried guilt, confusion, and a loneliness so deep it became part of his identity. But instead of collapsing under it, he did what he had always done since childhood. He picked up a camera because filmmaking wasn't just a dream anymore. It was survival. In the late 1960s, Spielberg was still young, still unknown, still fighting to be taken seriously. But inside him was something Hollywood executives could sense even before the world did. A rare instinct for storytelling, a sharp eye for emotion, and an ability to make audiences feel like they were living inside the scene. In 1968, he made a short film called Amblin. It wasn't a blockbuster. It wasn't even widely known. But when it was screened at a film festival, it hit Universal Studios executives like a lightning strike. They didn't just see talent. They saw a future. Spielberg understood immediately what this meant. This was the moment his life stopped being a hobby and became a mission. He dropped out of college to chase the thing he couldn't live without. He became an unpaid intern at Universal, and even when no one gave him a space to work, he found ways. He used empty offices. He stayed late. He acted like he already belonged, until the industry finally had no choice but to agree. Then in 1969, it happened. At only 22 years old, Spielberg signed a long-term contract with Universal, becoming the youngest director in Hollywood history to receive a deal like that. Overnight, the kid, who used to feel invisible, became the one everyone was watching. He began in television, directing episodes for shows like Night Gallery and Columbo. But his breakthrough arrived in 1971 with a TV film called Duel, a tense, terrifying chase between a man and a mysterious truck. Critics praised it, audiences were hooked, and suddenly Spielberg was no longer a promising kid. He was a threat, a director with a weapon Hollywood always fears: momentum. In 1974, he directed his first feature film, The Sugar Land Express. It was respected. It showed he could handle a bigger canvas, but nothing could have prepared anyone for what came next. A single film about a shark, a story so simple, yet so perfectly executed, it didn't just break records. It rewrote the rules of cinema. Jaws became a phenomenon, grossing more than $470 million and creating what the world now calls the summer blockbuster. Spielberg later admitted the shoot was brutal. There were moments he truly believed the production would collapse before the film was finished. But it didn't. It exploded. And with that explosion, Spielberg became a superstar. After that came Close Encounters of the Third Kind and E.T., films that proved he wasn't just a master of tension and spectacle. He was also a storyteller with tenderness, compassion, and a childlike sense of wonder that audiences couldn't resist. Then he went even deeper. He stepped into historical drama and war stories, films like Schindler's List and Saving Private Ryan, exploring moral conflict, human suffering, and the darkest edges of history, with a seriousness that stunned the world. By the 1990s, Spielberg wasn't just making movies. He was shaping culture. He co-founded DreamWorks in 1994 and helped produce massive successes that pushed Hollywood into new eras. Even as the decades passed, he stayed relevant, continuing to direct films like Lincoln, Bridge of Spies, and The Fabelmans, a story that circled back to the childhood wounds he once tried to bury. And yet, despite all the fame, Spielberg's personal life remained carefully guarded because behind the public legend was still a man shaped by family, love, and regret. For someone who built an entire career on his stories the world couldn't stop watching, Steven Spielberg spent most of his own life doing the opposite. He stayed private, careful, almost guarded. Even at the height of his fame, when cameras followed his every move, Spielberg tried to keep one thing protected at all costs: his family. His first marriage was to actress Amy Irving. They met when she auditioned for Close Encounters of the Third Kind in 1976. The chemistry was immediate, but their relationship moved slowly through the years. Eventually, they married in 1985, and that same year, they welcomed a son, Max Samuel. For a moment, it looked like Spielberg had built the stability he never had as a child. But Hollywood has a way of testing relationships. Only 4 years later, in 1989, Spielberg and Amy divorced. The separation drew enormous attention, partly because reports claimed the settlement was around $100 million. Despite the headlines, they maintained an amicable relationship for the sake of their son. Amy later said they did what was best for Max. Not long after, another chapter began. Years earlier, Spielberg had directed Indiana Jones and The Temple of Doom in 1984, and one of the faces on set was actress Kate Capshaw, who played Willie Scott. Spielberg met her during the audition process, then again through screen tests, and he admitted later that he was immediately impressed. Kate joked afterward that she never expected a role filled with screaming and chaos would lead her to the man who would become her life partner. During the production, they grew closer through shared conversations and time together, but the Spielberg was still in a relationship with Amy Irving then. So what existed between him and Kate stayed professional and restrained. That changed in 1989. After his divorce, Spielberg and Kate officially began dating. That same year, they moved in together. Kate later shared that they had been close on set, but had to wait for the right moment for it to become real. Before they married, Kate converted to Judaism. In 1991, they held both a civil ceremony and an Orthodox ceremony. Spielberg once said that marrying Kate made him rediscover pride in his Jewish heritage. Their relationship didn't just become a marriage, it became a large blended family. Kate had a daughter, Jessica, from a previous marriage. Spielberg had Max from his marriage to Amy. Together, they built a home that eventually included 7 children in total: Jessica, Max, Theo, Sasha, Sawyer, Michaela, and Destry. As the years passed, their marriage became one of the rare long-lasting unions in Hollywood. Over 3 decades together, a quiet exception in an industry known for relationships burning out fast. Their children grew up and pursued their own paths. Max became a game director and short film filmmaker. Jessica became an actress. Sawyer and Destry also pursued work in entertainment. And one story about Spielberg's family drew public attention in 2020 when his daughter Michaela spoke openly about working in adult films, saying it was her personal choice and that her family supported her. Outside of his own children, Spielberg also became known as a mentor to young actors, especially Drew Barrymore during E.T. He once said she needed a support system, and he felt responsible for being there. That same tenderness carried into his private life. He remained deeply connected to his children as they became adults, often describing family not as an escape from filmmaking, but as the reason he kept making films in the first place. He once said family was the source of inspiration behind every emotional story he told on the screen. And even in his late 70s, Spielberg remained highly active, still preparing new projects, still speaking, like a man who wasn't ready to slow down. But after Rob Reiner's tragic passing, Spielberg's perspective sharpened because it reminded him of something he already knew deep down. Fame does not protect you. Awards do not shield you. And even legends are fragile. By the time Spielberg reached his late 70s, most people expected him to slow down, to step back, to enjoy the legacy, to let younger names take the spotlight. But Spielberg didn't move like a man preparing for retirement. He moved like someone still chasing something. He once said he had never felt tired in the way people assumed he would, that every new project still felt like a chance to discover light in a different place, to tell a story the way only he could tell it. And those close to him noticed something else too: discipline. In an industry that can destroy people from excess, Spielberg seemed to tighten his focus with age. Reports around him pointed to a noticeable weight change from roughly 95 kilograms down to around 82, as if he had decided that if creativity was going to stay alive, his body had to keep up with it. Not for vanity, for survival, because Spielberg understood something most people don't see until it's too late. Time doesn't just pass. It takes energy, it takes people, it takes the illusion that tomorrow is guaranteed. And that is exactly why Rob Reiner's tragedy hit him like a hammer. After the deaths, Spielberg spoke from a place that felt raw, almost stripped of his usual distance. He said that losing Rob wasn't only about losing a filmmaker, it was about confronting the fragility of family and the terrifying truth that no amount of success can stop a personal nightmare from destroying everything you love. He reflected on how Rob had always embodied empathy and human connection through film. Rob made the stories that reminded people to care about one another. Yet even Rob, with all his wisdom and warmth, so could not escape a brutal reality inside his own home. Spielberg's words carried something heavier than grief, regret, because he remembered those moments when Rob had opened up about his son's addiction. He remembered the fear in Rob's eyes. He remembered telling him to hold on to hope, believing hope could be strong enough. Now, Spielberg realized how delicate that hope truly was. And in reflecting on this tragedy, Spielberg emphasized one lesson again and again. No matter how great the awards, no matter how famous the name, people are still at the center of every story. Not fame, not headlines, not box office numbers, people. He extended condolences to the Reiner family and honored Rob as someone who left an indelible mark on audiences. And he urged the public to remember Rob not only for the tragedy, but for the legacy he created. Films that will continue to make the world laugh, cry, and feel. Then Spielberg posed a question that lingered like a final line in a heartbreaking movie. Can Hollywood still preserve empathy and human connection? In a world that moves so fast it forgets people as soon as the next headline arrives? And that question, more than anything, revealed what Rob Reiner's death truly did to Spielberg. It didn't just hurt him, it reminded him that the only thing that matters is what you hold close before it's gone.